The year is 2013, and during a Nintendo Direct in December, all of a sudden you see this game get announced. Hyrule Warriors. Name not final, that's a strange title, but back when I was 14 years old as a die-hard Zelda fan, this simple bit of footage just looked next level. I had no idea what a Musou Warriors game was back in the day, but it sure enough had me hyped despite not even owning the Wii U at the time. Hyrule Warriors was to be a collaboration between Nintendo, Omega Force and Team Ninja, who were both development studios over at Koei Tecmo. And with most of the team's members already being die-hard fans of the Legend of Zelda series, it made sense when the opportunity came to make a Warriors game with Nintendo to go with this IP. All of this resulted in a game that was something truly special, despite how out there its concept seemed at first glance. But what even is a Musou Warrior style game, you ask? Well, simply put, it's a subgenre of action titles that consists of players taking down literal armies of enemies using easy to import light and heavy button combinations. Its name is derived from the Japanese translation of Dynasty Warriors, known as Shinsangoku Musou, which is where this gameplay originates from. It's a series that can be best described as mindless fun, which is sometimes the best kind of fun. When combining the rich history and beloved characters from The Legend of Zelda alongside the chaotic fun of Dynasty Warriors, the final product that the world saw was this oddly perfect blend of the two styles that felt like a beautiful love letter made by Zelda fans for Zelda fans. But before even beginning this review, it's important to recognise that there exist three versions of the original Hyrule Warriors. There was of course the Wii U release back in 2014, followed by Legends in 2016 on the 3DS, which despite having a lower resolution and frame rate introduced many new additions as well as quality of life features not in the Wii U version. There's also a boatload of downloadable content that both versions received that no longer exists due to the system's storefronts being shut down in 2023. So that only leaves us with 2018's Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition on Nintendo Switch, which combines all the quality of life features of Legends on top of it having all the previously released DLC, as well as it just looking and running even better than the Wii U release. Alright, with all that preamble settled, let's get right into this review, looking back at just what makes Hyrule Warriors so special even today. When it comes to its gameplay, each mission mostly boils down to you running around defeating grunt enemies in order to capture keeps, all whilst defending your own areas from being captured alongside taking down a boss at the end of a mission. It's a simple gameplay loop that's made all the more entertaining with just how many characters and weapons there is to experiment with. Hyrule Warriors takes many notes from more traditional RPGs, with our enemies drop materials and there being a whole leveling up system for each character, which ultimately boils down into a metagame which is pretty grindy if you want to min-max a particular character. You can also further unlock more attack moves and abilities to keep things from feeling stale, which really adds to this game's replay value. There's always something to do here, but it's not for the faint of heart when it comes to just how grindy it really is. For a casual player such as myself, I enjoy this approach. You're never going to struggle with the actual gameplay, so it does make sense for progression to be more level gated and material based, since what you're doing combat wise is very easy for a newcomer to pick up. So the game does reward players for actually investing time into it, just in less of a skill check kind of way, and boy can you invest a lot of time into some of these modes. But all of this is just the foundation of this title. What most people remember Hyrule Warriors for is its cast of characters, level themes and boss fights that really did remind me of why I fell in love with this series to begin with. Usually, the first thing that comes to mind when comparing just what makes Hyrule Warriors 1 so special and even better compared to its successors is with its massive roster of 29 playable characters. Just look at this, it's almost perfect with fan favourite picks from all across the series. You really can tell that the developers had fun when making this cast, since sure you have your obvious additions like Link, Zelda, Ganondorf and Impa, but you also have more out there choices like with Agatha, who attacks with a parasol of all things, calling down bugs to take down enemies. Then there's Tingle, who as you would expect is as unapologetically strange as ever, hoarding rupees and using his balloon as a weapon. I love the selection here. One aspect of modern Zelda I really do miss is the weird and wonderful characters of the past. Being reminded of Girahim with his weird tongue-licking thing, or Zant with whatever wacko stunt this is just a joy to see after so long, and this goes for most of the cast here. Their personalities really do shine in this game. The attention to detail here really does bring these characters to life, like how Fi attacks by dancing since she never was a fighter. This is some really good fan service, which is a term that's typically met with a negative connotation surrounding media, but these kinds of nods really do show how fan service can be pulled off well when given the right opportunity and place for it, like in a spin-off release for instance. But it's not just the Warriors gameplay that's appealing here, it's also the fact that you can actually play as these characters, which is the first and only time that's ever been a thing for some of these beloved NPCs from our bygone days. That really is what a spin-off should allow for. A character like Marion could only really be brought back in a game like this, where lore and canonical reasoning is thrown out the window in order to celebrate the things that made this series so amazing to begin with. It was also the first time that we'd ever get to see how a lot of these characters would look like in HD, and in some cases even in 3D. Marion's come a long way from her Game Boy sprite. But with that being said, despite how much I love this roster, it could always be better. Most of these picks I think deserve to be here, but I also would have loved to have seen the Running Man included. He could have such a fun moveset. Or maybe even the three goddesses attacking with their own elements. Varter was also a pretty big fan favourite at one point, or heck even Dompe, and you know what, why not bring in Morshu whilst you're at it? They had tons of choices to go with when it comes to this IP, which only begs the question on why they gave Yuga a character slot. Like seriously, is this anyone's favourite Zelda character? He's up there with Agamin for most forgettable antagonist, and it doesn't help that his moveset kinda sucks. I do think that the overall roster they went with was almost perfect, however even then it could have always have been better given just how many choices they had at their disposal. But this style also has substance. Each character has their own unique moveset, and Koei Tecmo added tons of weapons which reference previous games that completely change how you play these characters. Some of my particular favourites is the spin-off from Twilight Princess for Link. It just looks ridiculous, enough said. There's also the baton from Wind Waker for Zelda, which lets you unleash a tornado onto enemies Katamari style. It's very satisfying to use once you understand it. I also like Alana's Deku staff, which summons the Great Tree himself and allows you to glide using the Deku leaf. And it would also be wrong of me not to mention the Great Fairy weapon, which I mean is just insane with how clunky it feels to use, but it's a good laugh. Poor Link trapped in a fairy bottle. I guess all those years of capturing fairies have finally caught up to him. I really like how these weapons aren't just generic melee and ranged arms, with them instead having more outlandish and unique movesets over what you typically see in this genre. Hyrule Warriors really does stick the landing of having a diverse selection of characters and weapons to use, which complements its repetitive gameplay loop, but let's now take a look at the game's story mode to see how well it holds up today. The game's narrative does make an attempt at tying all of this together and explaining how these worlds came together in the first place. As you would expect from a spin-off that combines characters across different timelines, things are kept fairly simple when it comes to how its story is told. You've got your standard Zelda mainstays like there being a Hyrule, an Impa, a Link, but Koei Tecmo also wrote in some of their own original characters since this game doesn't have any connection to the series' timeline. So instead of it being the series standard of courage and wisdom against power, it's about a sorceress who looks over time protecting the Triforce. And after seeing Link, she oddly enough develops feelings for him on the spot. I mean, who wouldn't? But this small lapse in judgment allows the benevolent evil spirits to let that emotion run rampant, which splits the soul of the sorceress into two. There's Sia, who is this game's main antagonist, and Lana, who manifests the good of the sorceress. But I'll be honest, this story pretty much boils down to some anime girl wanting to date Link and turning evil because she can't have him. It's a bit strange, but not completely out of left field, considering all the women in the past games that have also wanted to be with Link. The story is just a crutch to have all these worlds collide, so I don't really mind it. Sia and Lana do fit the more light-hearted vibes that the game's going for, and future titles would somewhat prove that sometimes having a serious canonical story isn't always what's best for these kinds of spin-offs. Personally, I don't really mind this game's narrative simply acts as an excuse to have this best of look at the series, with you reliving certain key moments from the Legend of Zelda's history. Of course, as a fan, your mileage may vary, but as a standalone story, it's fine, but nothing worth raving about. I do like the painting look they went with for some of the cutscenes in this game. They remind me of those murals from the Wind Waker. This would also be one of the last Zelda titles to not have voice acting, and I feel like at times it would have benefited from having the characters talk, especially with the CGI cutscenes. But I do get why they didn't go for this, since casting old fan favourites would have been very jarring to see. I don't think the world is actually ready to ever hear Tingle speak, that just sounds cursed. That being said, there is a narrator, although most of these cutscenes are merely just bland low screen narration, which is something future Hyrule Warriors games will improve upon, with cutscenes having better overall production values with their animation and presentation compared to this one. Overall, this is a fine campaign with plenty of boss fights and different level themes. Legends on the 3DS also added an epilogue with the Wind Waker's world, and there's also a few side stories which better elaborate on the origins of this game's original characters. Its first side campaign is centered on the main villains, and it's fairly by the books, just explaining how they came together, nothing special, but the other side story is one I felt like it's worth bringing attention to, that being with Linkle. Her origin story is an interesting one. The concept of a female Link dates as far back as this one Japanese Link to the Past drawing where the magazine artist confused Link's gender. And back when the Wii U version of Hyrule Warriors launched, this piece of concept art for a female Link was met with a ton of fan outcry to have her be an actual character. I can't really say I'm a fan of this generic bikini armor look, but hey, the finalized Linkle design that they went with is a good one. Some concepts also show Linkle having pink hair, which could be a possible nod to how Link's sprite looked on the Super Nintendo, which would have been a pretty cool reference. Her whole shtick is that she's an incarnation of the hero, but she's on her own adventure, getting lost and ultimately saving the day. It's presented like a Saturday morning cartoon with how she can't find Hyrule Castle. I do wish that Linkle had more of a presence in the actual story, but her being added later on could possibly explain why her involvement here is pretty minor. I do like her green hood and crossbows being a possible nod to the best Zelda game ever made, Link's crossbow training. Like, damn guys, that's a pretty deep cut reference right there. But even beating the entirety of Legends mode is barely even a drop in the ocean when it comes to experiencing all that this game has to offer. Heck, you could even call all this a prologue of sorts when compared to the adventure mode. These overworld boards act as challenges, having you navigate in 8-bit renditions of previous Zelda worlds, unlocking different characters, weapons and costumes. But I must stress this next point, do not be fooled, for this mode is not for the faint of heart. If you're the kind of person that goes into every game with a completionist mentality, then stay the heck away from here. You can really easily pour hundreds of hours into completing every board and leveling up your characters. It's fun, but definitely flawed, since this is where the game's grind and repetitive nature is out on full display, since every level, map and boss is taken from the story mode. Now that we've covered the best aspects of Hyrule Warriors, I do have to admit it does have some minor flaws that was later fixed in future games. For instance, its boss fights, despite being a nice callback, a lot of the time require you to stand and wait for them to reveal an opening. Which is alright for the actual games that they originate from, but with the Warriors gameplay where most missions are time gated, having to rely on a boss randomly letting you hit it can be pretty frustrating. On a similar note, in Definitive Edition, its only downgrade between the Wii U and 3DS versions is with its map. Because it's no longer on a separate screen like it was intended to be, having it be squished on the same viewpoint makes it less clear to see, especially in docked mode on the TV. There can also be tons of pings going off all at once, which can make it hard to keep track of what's even going on at times. I'm also not a fan of how only specific characters can pick up heart containers to add to their own health bars. This can lead to some extremely tedious moments where you'll have to repeat a mission in adventure mode all because you didn't select a specific character. Which, on top of adventure mode, sometimes brutal ranking system, can only bring even more anxiety to Hyrule Warriors' gameplay. I mean, there's nothing worse than spending up to 20 minutes, sometimes even longer on one mission, only to have to do it again because you didn't kill so many enemies or beat the level quick enough. It's absolutely best to play this game as a casual enjoyer, trust me, you'll feel more than burnt out if you want to unlock everything here. It's not worth the time investment. There's only so many times I can bomb some of the dongos, which can suck since I love some of the skins in this game, especially the callbacks, but the grind and difficulty just got the better of me at times. But moving on from Hyrule Warriors' criticisms, I'd like to briefly talk about some of the more miscellaneous points about the game. Its music, for instance, is amazing, having it mostly be comprised of high-octane electric guitar remixes of well-known Zelda tracks. Its art style is also worth commenting on. Outside of the Wind Waker HD and that one Wii U tech demo, this was the first time we'd ever see the Zelda series in HD, and as a one-off release, I kind of like this more anime look that Koei Tecmo went with when it comes to redesigning Link, Zelda and Ganondorf. Link in particular has a blue scarf, which would go on to be his primary colour scheme in the open world Zeldas, which I doubt is the reason behind it, but it's a neat coincidence nonetheless. Speaking of character design, some of Koei Tecmo's original characters were met with criticism back in the day. I'm a big fan of Lana. Sure, her blue hair idol look isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Zelda, but she oddly fits in with this spin-off. But where people raised an eyebrow was with Cia's design. There is an argument to be made how she's somewhat sexualized here. In some ways, you could argue that her provocative design makes sense as someone who wants to win over Link, but even then, this is a bit too anime. And I'm not really a fan of her motive in the game's story, especially when her boss intro has the same TNA shot Camilla had in Fire Emblem Fates. I feel like they should have designed her more like how she looks in a role that you can unlock. I think this looks a little better. But like with any crossover game, there does need to be a balance between both series involved, and in this case with Dynasty Warriors and The Legend of Zelda, I don't mind overall with the direction they took when creating their original characters. Wizro looks spot on for a Zelda anime, and his design is heavily inspired by the pose and wouldn't look too out of place in a mainline entry. I'm glad Nintendo allowed Koei Tecmo to make their own creative liberties with this game. You can tell they had more freedoms here than with future games. Speaking of, one of the biggest monkey paw situations with this sub-series is how fans wanted a game that's actually canonical with the Zelda lore. I remember this pretty clearly because I was one of them, and what we ended up getting was Age of Imprisonment, a title that was pretty disappointing to me personally. Which is why I wanted to go back to this entry to remind myself of why I even liked these games to begin with. I mean, just look at this roster. It's so disappointing. Age of Imprisonment's roster is like in the next Smash game. Instead of having Mario or Samus, you had a Toad called John Nintendo and Miles McKenzie of all people. This title is such a far cry in quality compared to the first Hyrule Warriors, and the magic of this release is one I feel like hasn't been replicated since it came out. The Zelda series has changed a lot since the first Hyrule Warriors, but Nintendo and Koei Tecmo absolutely cooked with this game. Typically I write these reviews after doing everything a title has to offer, but that's the thing with Hyrule Warriors, the experience is simply too big for most people to see every corner of. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Hopefully this video has served as a reminder of this once great spin-off game and has maybe even convinced you to dust off your old cophead to relive a simpler time. One free from online discourse, just enjoying some chill vibes that serves as an amazing way to remind us of why we always loved the Legend of Zelda series to begin with. If you managed to get to the end of this video, let me just say thank you so much for watching. Do you have any memories of this game? Feel free to share them in the comments, and any feedback is always appreciated. Take care, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.